One of the ideas behind this course was inspired, and inspiration and resonance is an important part of this course, inspired by the summer of 2020 protests and marches around George Floyd's murder, and in part the continued protests around Black Lives Matter. Uh, One of the most impacting movements that we've seen in the last 50 years in the United States. And what I noticed about, besides being myself a social movement scholar, someone who both as an anthropologist and ethnographer, someone who's really interested also in race, class, and space, the way they intersect. What I was really interested in is the way in which, especially artists, performers, and so forth, were able to build solidarity, find resonance in the movement, and how they, for instance, used downtown Oakland as their canvas, uh, as uh, as what do you, plywood went up on windows for fear of quote unquote riots or looting. Uh, One of the things that these artists did was um, put up murals, paintings, graffiti of representing the movement itself. And so it really got me to thinking about how this resonance of cultural production that's tied to a politics that's embedded in community practice of a long history of muralism that's not only a part of the Bay Area, but part of its internationalist roots, how it connects around the question of urban space, how we think about Oakland as one of those emerging Black political spaces, for instance, in the United States, and at the same time, how it faces, for instance, anti-Black urban renewal, anti-Black formations in spatial arrangements. So I was really wanting to think about that historically, but also as a project that might be able to have students and those who participate uh, interview, talk to the artists themselves, but also produce certain projects that I've been looking at, or at least been using in my classes to get to these questions through podcasting and augmented reality. And I wanted to begin with, in part, something that to me is always a way I think about this relationship between social movements and in what political context do they emerge from? I think oftentimes we think they emerge in a particular vacuum and so forth, but they emerge in a particular social political moment. And in understanding that moment, we can understand how they go through a series of contested terrains around space, especially around their meaning, as that is constructed in different places and by different people. For instance, here we have the famous America Tropical, a fresco mural that was painted on the side of the old Italian house in downtown Los Angeles, and the oldest part of Los Angeles, in the Placita Olvera area of Los Angeles, by the famous muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros. And in 1932, when this mural was commissioned, and it was commissioned by the kind of wealthy aristocracy of LA, in a sense, who at that time were very much involved in anything Mexican, especially pre-Columbian Mexican. That is, that they bought a lot of trinkets, a lot of materials from the kind of first archaeological sites and so forth, anything that they considered to be folkloric in regards to Mexican art in particular. And they were fascinated by the famous muralists of that time, in that period, David Alfaro Siqueiros, Diego Rivera, and others, Orozco. They were fascinated with their art, many of them trained transcontinentally in Europe and in the Americas, but they weren't necessarily attached to their politics. Siqueiros and Rivera, for instance, being communists. And Siqueiros, who came to the United States and commissioned to do this particular fresco mural, painted a controversial mural, something that at first was lauded in the Los Angeles Times, which at that time had been already a yellow newspaper in terms of the negative stereotypes of Mexicans. And everyone said, wow, what a masterpiece. But upon looking at it a little bit further, they found that the mural itself had depictions that corresponded to what they thought, or what they were saying was anti-American images and discourses. So almost the next day, the mural was whitewashed. Now, whitewashing is something important in the class. We think about whitewashing. That is, to me, I'm thinking about all those murals and all those different art pieces right now in Oakland that are right now, many of the businesses are keeping up. But at some point, business will go on in a sense. And what will happen to the very memory of those art pieces? So similar to what other courses are focusing on in this amazing endeavor this summer around Futurist Histories, I wanted us to think about this question of whitewashing and amnesia that happens in urban spaces like places like Oakland, San Francisco, in particular the Mission, which is, I think, one of the capitals of the United States of this kind of politicized art connected to this internationalism. And I wanted us to think about what it means. And so in this case, the 1932 whitewashing, actually no one even paid much attention to it. That is, it was successful in its whitewashing, in its amnesia, up until probably the late 1990s, early 2000s, when it started to actually surface while people were trying to tar up and remodel the old Italian house. And once they saw that there was an actual painting in the back of this whitewash, they said, oh, this is something that we need to, in a sense, memorialize, or at least be able to reconstruct and rebuild and so forth. And this is where the narrative of the past comes into play. And I'm a big person, particularly around the politics of history, a la vis-a-vis Michel Roth-Trouillot, in terms of how we give meaning to the past, how we construct meanings of the past. And art, public art, especially when it's tied to social protest, is constantly referring to the past as it is itself moving in the present and seeking new futures. And in this case, how people attached to a particular moment, America Tropical, was at a moment in Los Angeles where Chicano murals of the 1960s and 70s were now something to create as a Los Angeles art movement. In the 1960s and 70s, it was protest art, but by the early 2000s, it became something of a part of the LA story. So that is almost a contradiction in part, because it definitely wasn't that in the 60s and 70s. And similar to what the context of the 1932 mural, where at that very moment, Mexicans were being corralled and packed into buses and trains being sent back to Mexico as part of a Mexican repatriation program, the social context. Similarly, in the 2000s, we have the constant bombardment of anti-immigrant discourse. So what's different here? Well, one of the things is that now Chicano movement art, which is now viewed as official Los Angeles art, views and attaches itself to the political art of the 1930s and sees its significance as an important one. But here's the thing. The mayor of Los Angeles, who had just recently won the election in 2005, Antonio Villaraigosa, went up and talked in front of reporters and said, even though it was unpopular in the time, now we are here to celebrate it and so forth. Again, creating a discourse of amnesia that's tied to its initial politics, and in fact, not talking about Siqueiros' anti-imperialist politics, in which America Tropical was formed and inspired by. So what I wanted to think about, and what some of the initial questions I have as part of the project, not solely the basis of the project, is this question of whitewashing. How do we understand such initial whitewashing? What is the context in which 1930s Los Angeles or late 2010s Oakland and Minneapolis, in what context do they emerge out of, right? In this case, we're talking about the continued appearance of police violence, racism, institutional racism, and so forth. But we're going to get into a little bit more of those details, especially when it comes to urban planning. We're going to use obviously other methods of thinking about that in regards to humanities approaches and so forth. And we're going to be asking the artists themselves, especially the collectives that went up and started to paint on walls throughout Oakland and other parts of the Bay Area. And we're going to do so by asking them first, what motivated them to do so, but also how they connect themselves or see their art as part of a rejuvenated community response to these forms of violences and displacements and so forth. So I wanted us to think about that. Similarly, when we think about, for instance, the famous work of Juana Alicia throughout the Bay Area, that in the 1980s and 90s and even to today, describe, for instance, the mass movement of Central Americans who came due to war and civil war in particular, but violence. These very, I think, products of public art speak to protest, speak to the way that we can think about how social protests, social movements are about recovering memory and history, but they're also about creating that, creating their own understandings. And so part of it is locating that within the class throughout the lab that we'll have for 6 weeks. And obviously the more current ones are the ones that we'll find in downtown Oakland. One of the main then guiding questions is, what does it mean to produce public art in an era of permanent protest? And I truly believe we are in a moment of permanent protest. Now, this here has to be defined clearly, because there's a difference between protest on the Capitol to some degree and then protest when we're talking about social justice. And here we'll have this conversation because I think it's one that still fashions the way that we think about urban space. What role do these art collectives, especially the ones that are working on these pieces, and artivists, a term used by many to describe them as artists and activists, see their murals playing in a broader struggle? And what techniques and approaches do they have? So those questions will drive us to create 2 different projects: podcasts that are formed not only by interviewing many of these artists and collectives, but also in terms of different topics and themes that we see relevant to the construction of, or to the knowledge that we'll be thinking about and producing when it comes to public art. I've been working on podcasts in my classrooms now for over 2 years. I am the coordinator of a UC Berkeley Changemaker project that is hoping to institutionalize podcast studio and other forms of technologies, especially around ethnic studies, and in particular looking at the intersections of race, class, space, and other intersecting points. And podcasting here creates what we are definitely looking for in the future histories, which is a project that can lead and be more accessible to broader audiences, to create dialogue outside of just the university. Podcasts have a great amount of accessibility and could be even a greater place of accessibility for those communities to have a voice, to give voice as to why and how they produce this form of cultural art. At the same time, I'm also really kind of dabbling, as Susan mentioned in her project, like on augmented reality, in part because one of the ways, still thinking about this question of amnesia and whitewashing, is the way that we can use, for instance, augmented reality so as to construct projects that can place those pieces that have been whitewashed in locations and create our own politics of understanding movements in locations. At the same time, even place conversations onto those augmented realities by which we can include information about the artist through their own words, and continue to think about how to use such mediums as a subversive form of art, by which it carries now layers of meaning beyond just the urban material landscape. And so one of the community partners that I'm speaking to right now And one of the main artists is Cici Carpio. Tomorrow I'll be talking to her even more about this project as we're trying to solidify a partnership. Is Trust Your Struggle, a group of artists from throughout the Bay Area who have done internationally pieces all over the world, on Filipino social movements, on social movements in Mexico, throughout the United States, New York, the Bay Area, and who were, I think, is very essential to a lot of the murals that we find in downtown Oakland. So we'll be working and talking with many of those artists, and possibly even hopefully working on a mural ourselves that can be produced in one of the spaces that are still available to paint. If not, still produce one that is done by augmented reality, where we can place it as an augmented reality in whatever space.